The knock on the door came 3 times, hard and fast, and Elira Voss knew before she opened it that something had gone wrong. Her sister Wren stood on the other side, soaked from the rain, her hands shaking so badly she could not hold the shawl closed over her shoulders. Behind her, at the end of the muddy lane, 2 men in dark coats waited beside a horse cart, watching the house with the patience of men who had done this before. Elira pulled Wren inside and shut the door, though the wood was thin and offered no real protection from anything. "What did you do?" Elira said. It was not a question. It was the sentence she had been saying to her younger sister since they were children, and it never once stopped a disaster from arriving. Wren's eyes were red. "I did not think it would go this far." "Wren." "There was a game, cards, everyone was playing, and I was winning, and then I was not winning. And then I owed more than I had, so I signed something, and I did not read it carefully. And now they say I owe a life, not money, a life. Elira, they said the pack takes what is not paid in coin." Elira grabbed her sister's wrists to stop the flood of words. "Which pack?" "Thornfield." The name landed in the small kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Everyone in the valley knew the Thornfield pack collected debts the way other people collected rent, except Thornfield collected in blood, in service, in bodies handed over to work fields until death arrived to end the contract early. Nobody who went to work for Thornfield came back with the same face they left with. "How much time?" Elira asked. 3 days. 3 days. Elira looked at her sister, 19 years old, reckless in the way only someone who had never truly suffered could be reckless, and she felt the old weight settle back onto her shoulders, the weight she had carried since their parents died, and left her the only adult in a house of 2. "We will find a way," Elira said, though she did not believe it as she said it. That night she sat at the kitchen table with a single candle and did the math over and over, hoping a different answer would appear, if she just added the numbers one more time. It never did. The debt was more than the house was worth, more than every coin she had saved working double shifts at the mill, more than anything Wren could earn in a decade of honest labor. There was no path through it that did not end with her sister disappearing into Thornfield land, never to be seen again. She did not sleep that night. She sat with the candle until it burned down to nothing and the sun came up gray and unhelpful through the window, and she still had no answer. The knock came again the next morning, but this time it was not Wren. It was a stranger, a tall man in a coat the color of dried blood, with a wax seal on the folded paper he held out to her. "Elira Voss?" he asked. "Who is asking?" "I come from the Royal Court of Ashgrove Hold. I have a proposal for you, on behalf of King Kalin Ashgrove." Elira almost laughed. The king, the Alpha King, the man who ruled every pack in the region, including Thornfield, though people said he rarely interfered in pack business unless it touched the crown directly. Why would his court knock on the door of a mill worker in a valley with nothing to offer? "I do not understand," she said. "May I come in?" She let him in, because refusing a royal envoy seemed like a fast way to make her situation worse, not better. He sat at the same table where she had spent the night doing hopeless arithmetic, and he laid the folded paper flat and did not open it right away. "The king is unmarried," the envoy said. "The council grows restless about it. They believe a king without a queen is a king who can be replaced, or worse, a king who can be quietly pushed aside while they run the kingdom through him. He needs a wife, quickly, quietly, someone with no political ties, no family who might try to use the marriage for power. And you came to me. We came to several names. Yours was one of them. We understand your sister has an urgent debt to the Thornfield pack." Elira went very still. "How do you know about that?" "The Crown knows most things that happen inside its borders, Miss Voss. It simply chooses when to act on that knowledge." "What are you offering?" The envoy finally opened the paper and turned it so she could read it. It was a marriage contract, her name already written into the blank where a bride's name would go, as though someone had been confident enough in her answer to prepare it in advance. "You marry the king," the envoy said. "In exchange, the crown pays your sister's debt in full, and Thornfield's claim on her is erased. Permanently. No pack in this kingdom can collect a debt the crown has settled. Your sister will be safe. What does the king get from this? A wife. A queen the council cannot easily object to, because you come with no army, no rival house, no political weight of your own. It calms the court. It buys him time." "Time for what?" The envoy folded his hands. "That is not something I am permitted to discuss." Elira looked at the paper for a long moment. She thought of Wren, soaked and shaking in the doorway the night before. She thought of the valley stories about Thornfield land, the workers who went in and the very few who ever came back out, and when they did come back, how they did not speak much anymore, and how their eyes had gone somewhere far away and never quite returned. She thought about herself, 24 years old, unmarried, with no prospects beyond the mill and the small house that would eventually fall down around her from neglect she could not afford to fix. She had nothing to lose by leaving this life. She had everything to lose by losing her sister. "I need to see my sister safe first," Elira said, "before I sign anything. The crown does not work that way. The marriage happens first. The debt is cleared the same day, as part of the same transaction. You have my word, and the word of the crown, that Thornfield's claim will be void the moment the ceremony is complete. Your word means nothing to me. I do not know you. Then you have a choice to make, Miss Voss. Trust a crown you have never met, or trust that your sister survives 3 more days on her own against a debt she cannot pay." It was not really a choice at all, and they both knew it. "I will do it," Elira said. The envoy did not smile exactly, but something in his face relaxed, as though he had expected this answer, and was relieved not to have to argue further. He slid the paper toward her and offered a pen. "One more thing," Elira said, before she signed. "What is he like, the king?" "His Majesty is a private man. He does not speak much in court. Some believe this makes him weak. I would not advise repeating that opinion in his presence. That is not an answer. It is the only one I am permitted to give." Elira signed the paper with a hand that did not shake nearly as much as she expected it to. When it was done, the envoy took the contract, folded it back into its original creases, and stood. "A carriage will come for you in 2 days," he said. "Bring only what you need. Everything else, the crown will provide. And my sister will be told the debt is settled the moment you arrive at Ashgrove Hold, not before. That is not what we agreed. That is exactly what we agreed, Miss Voss. Read the paper again if you doubt me." He left without further explanation, and Elira sat alone at the table with the candle burned to a stub beside her, wondering exactly what kind of arrangement she had just bound herself into, and whether trust was a currency the crown ever intended to spend on someone like her. She told Wren that evening, keeping her voice steady, keeping the details simple. A marriage, to the king, in exchange for the debt disappearing. Wren cried, apologized so many times the words lost their shape, and begged Elira not to do it, to find another way, any other way. "There is no other way," Elira said. "There never was. You do not even know him. I do not need to know him. I need you alive and free of Thornfield land. That is all I need from any of this." Wren wrapped her arms around her sister and held on the way she used to when they were small and frightened of the dark, and Elira held her back and did not let herself think too hard about what waited at the end of the road she had just agreed to walk. 2 days later, the carriage came, just as the envoy had promised. It was finer than anything Elira had ever ridden in. Dark wood polished to a shine, the royal crest painted in gold on the door. She stood in the lane with a single bag containing everything she owned worth taking, and she looked back once at the small house, at Wren standing in the doorway with tears on her face and something like hope trying to break through the fear. "I will send word when I can," Elira called. "Be careful," Wren called back. "Please, whatever he is like, be careful." Elira climbed into the carriage without answering, because she did not know yet whether careful was even a thing she would be allowed to be, married to a king she had never met, for reasons that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with survival. The door closed. The horses started forward. The house, the lane, the valley, all of it began to shrink behind her, and ahead of her lay a road she could not see the end of, leading toward a man whose face she did not know, and whose silence, the envoy had warned without quite warning her, was something she should learn to be careful around. She spent the ride rehearsing, a soft smile, downcast eyes at the right moments, the posture of a woman grateful for a marriage she had chosen freely, rather than one she had been forced into by debt and desperation. She practiced it in the reflection of the carriage window, over and over, because she understood, even before arriving, that the lie only worked if she believed it herself first, and she intended to believe it as completely as it took to keep her sister safe. The carriage rolled on through hills she had never seen, past villages that grew smaller and further apart, until the road began to climb, and somewhere ahead, past the tree line, the first gray towers of Ashgrove Hold came into view, taller than anything Elira had ever imagined standing so close to the sky. She pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window, and did not look away from it, not even once, all the way up the long road toward the gates. By the time the carriage reached the outer wall, evening had settled over the hills, painting the towers in shades of orange and gray. Guards in dark uniforms stood at attention beside the gate, and one of them stepped forward to open the carriage door, before it had even fully stopped moving. "Welcome to Ashgrove Hold," the guard said, offering his hand to help her down. His name, she would later learn, was Garrick, captain of the king's personal guard, though in that moment he was simply a stranger's hand steadying her as her legs, stiff from the long ride, found solid ground again. Alira stepped out and looked up at the hold rising above her, stone and iron and history layered on top of itself for centuries, and she understood, standing there in her travel-worn dress with her single bag still gripped in one hand, that whatever happened next, there was no road back to the valley that did not pass first through whatever waited for her inside these walls. "This way, Your Grace," Garrick said, and it took her a moment to realize he was speaking to her, that the title now belonged to her whether she felt it fit or not. She followed him toward the great doors, her heart loud in her own ears, rehearsing one final time the soft smile, the grateful eyes, the performance she had built the entire ride to protect her sister with. The doors opened, warm light spilled out into the evening, and somewhere beyond that light, for the first time, stood the king she had agreed to marry without ever having met him. The great hall of Ashgrove Hold was lit by more candles than Alira had ever seen in one room, and every one of them seemed to be watching her as she walked in. Court members lined the walls in silk and fur, whispering behind gloved hands, and at the far end of the hall, on a raised platform, stood a man she had not expected. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dressed simply for a king, in dark gray rather than gold, and he did not smile when she approached. He watched her with an intensity that made her want to look away, except she had promised herself she would not look away, not tonight, not in front of people already looking for reasons to doubt her. Garrick stopped a few paces from the platform and bowed. "Your Majesty, the Lady Alira Voss." The king said nothing. He simply looked at her, his eyes moving from her face to her hands and back again, as though he was reading something written on her skin that she could not see herself. Alira curtsied, the way she had practiced in her small bedroom mirror the night before, and waited. Still, he said nothing. The silence stretched long enough that Alira felt heat rise in her cheeks, and she began to wonder if she had done something wrong, if there was some greeting she had failed to give, some word she should have said first. A few of the court members exchanged looks, and one woman near the front, dressed richer than anyone else in the hall, let out a small, cold laugh behind her fan. "He does not often speak first," Garrick said quietly, close enough that only Alira could hear. "Speak to him plainly, he will understand." Alira did not fully grasp what that meant, not yet, but she took the advice anyway. "Your Majesty," she said, straightening her shoulders, "I am grateful for the honor you have shown my family. I will not embarrass your court." The king's eyes stayed on her mouth the entire time she spoke, unmoving, focused, and only after she finished did he give a single nod, slow and deliberate, and turn his head toward Garrick and make a small motion with his hand. Garrick nodded in return. "The king says you are welcome here, and that the ceremony will take place in 3 days' time, once your rooms are prepared, and the court has been formally informed." Alira blinked. "He said all of that with one gesture?" "His Majesty communicates through sign and through reading lips," Garrick said, his voice pitched low, careful. "He has been deaf since the Battle of Ember Ridge, 5 years past. Most of the court has learned enough sign to manage basic matters. I would advise you learn quickly as well." The words landed on Alira with the force of a missed step on a staircase, that lurching moment when the ground is not where the foot expects it. Deaf. The king was deaf. Nobody, not the envoy, not a single soul in the 2 days since she signed the contract had told her this. She had walked into this hall assuming his silence was the silence of arrogance, of a man too important to bother speaking to a bride he had not chosen for love. Instead, it was something else entirely, something she had misunderstood so completely that shame flickered through her chest before she could stop it. She looked back at the king. He was still watching her, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, as though he had seen the realization cross her face, and understood exactly what had caused it. He did not look offended. If anything, there was the faintest suggestion of something almost amused in the set of his mouth, gone again before she could be certain she had seen it at all. "Your Majesty," Alira said again, slower this time, making sure her lips moved clearly. "I did not know. I apologize if I seemed foolish." Garrick did not translate this time. The king had clearly read it directly from her mouth, because he gave a short shake of his head, the universal gesture for "no, it is fine," and then turned and walked from the platform without another glance at the assembled court, leaving Alira standing there with her heart hammering and half the hall still whispering behind their hands. "That went well," said the cold-voiced woman near the front, not quite quietly enough to be missed. A few nearby nobles laughed. Garrick stepped closer to Alira, his voice firm now, meant to be heard. Lady Elsbeth finds most things beneath her notice, your grace. Pay her no mind. Alira filed the name away. Lady Elsbeth, someone to watch. She was led from the hall to a set of rooms in the eastern tower, rooms far grander than anything she had lived in before, with tall windows overlooking the valley below, and a bed larger than the entire kitchen of her old house. A young woman with dark hair and a quick, careful smile was waiting inside, introduced as Leora, assigned to assist her. You will need this, Leora said, once the door was closed and it was only the two of them. She held out a small, worn book, its pages soft from handling. Basic signs. Everything from greetings to court terms. His Majesty prefers when people try, even badly, over people who do not try at all. Alira took the book. Why did no one tell me before I arrived? About him being deaf. Leora hesitated. It is not something the crown advertises freely. There are members of court who use it against him when they can. Some believe a king who cannot hear is a king who can be tricked, or spoken over, or ruled through the back door while he is none the wiser. It is not true, not even close, but the belief is useful to men like Councilman Thornfield, so it persists. Thornfield, Alira repeated, and cold fear moved through her stomach at the name. The pack that held my sister's debt. Councilman Dreas Thornfield sits on the King's Council, Leora said. The pack and the council seat are the same family. I would be careful mentioning your sister's situation to anyone outside these rooms, until the marriage is finished and the debt is truly cleared. Word travels fast here, and not always kindly. Alira sat down heavily on the edge of the enormous bed, the book of signs clutched in both hands, and let herself, for one moment, feel the full weight of everything she had walked into. A deaf king nobody had warned her about. A council seat held by the very family her sister owed a debt to. A court already circling her with suspicion before she had even said her vows. Is he cruel? Alira asked quietly. The king. Leora considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. No. Careful, yes. Guarded, certainly. But not cruel. I have served in this hold 3 years, and I have never once seen him raise his hand or his voice, though I suppose the voice part is complicated in his case. A small, genuine smile crossed her face. He listens more than any hearing man I have ever met, just not with his ears. That night, alone in the vast, unfamiliar room, Alira lit a single candle out of old habit, though the room already had a dozen lamps burning, and she opened the small book of signs Leora had given her. She practiced the shapes with her fingers until they ached. Greetings, thank you, yes, no, safe, family, over and over in the candlelight, determined that whatever else went wrong in this arrangement, she would not stand in front of that man again and fail to understand him. She thought of Wren, back in the valley, and wondered if word of the cleared debt had reached her yet, if her sister was sleeping soundly for the first time in weeks, free of the fear that had driven her to Alira's door soaked and shaking. She hoped so. She hoped it fiercely, the way she hoped for very little else in her life anymore. And she let that hope carry her, finally, into a sleep too exhausted to be troubled by the size of the bed, or the strangeness of the tower, or the unread expression on the face of the king she had promised, 3 days from now, to marry. The next morning came with a knock far gentler than the one that had started all of this, and Leora entered with a tray of food and a folded piece of paper, sealed not with wax this time, but tied simply with a thin ribbon. From His Majesty, Leora said, setting it down. Alira untied the ribbon with fingers that were not quite steady. Inside was a single line of handwriting, careful, deliberate, the penmanship of a man who chose his words with the same caution he seemed to choose everything else. I am told you learned last night that I am deaf, and that no one warned you beforehand. That was not my doing, and I am sorry for it. If you have questions, ask them plainly. I will always answer plainly in return. Alira read it twice, then a third time, and something in her chest loosened just slightly. A knot she had not fully realized she was carrying. She did not know this man. She did not love him and had no plans to. But this note, small and simple as it was, told her something she had not expected to learn so soon. That whatever else waited for her in this marriage, dishonesty from him, at least, was not going to be one of the dangers she needed to guard against. She folded the note carefully and placed it inside the small book of signs, and she began, that very morning, to prepare herself properly for the 3 days that stood between her and the ceremony that would decide the rest of her life. 3 days passed faster than Alira expected, filled with fittings for a wedding dress she had never imagined wearing, lessons in court etiquette from a stern older woman named Fenna who also served as the hold's healer, and long hours practicing signs with Leora until her fingers moved through the shapes without her having to think about each one first. On the morning of the second day, restless and unable to sit still in her rooms any longer, Elira wandered the halls of the hold on her own, telling herself she was simply learning the layout of the place she would now call home. She found herself in a long gallery lined with paintings of past kings and queens, their painted eyes following her as she walked, and at the far end of the gallery, seated alone at a small table by a window, was the king. He was reading, a stack of papers in front of him, a quill resting beside an inkwell, and he did not notice her at first. Elira almost turned to leave, not wanting to intrude, but something made her stay, curious despite herself about the man she would soon be bound to for the rest of her life. He looked different like this, alone, unguarded. The careful stillness she had seen in the great hall was gone, replaced by something more natural, shoulders slightly hunched over his work, brow furrowed in concentration. When he finally glanced up and saw her standing there, he did not startle the way most people would at being watched unaware. He simply set down his quill and waited, patient, for her to either speak or leave. Elira stepped closer, remembering the note he had sent her. Ask plainly. She had spent the last 2 nights practicing exactly this moment in her head. I did not mean to disturb you, she signed, slow and careful, the shapes still new enough in her hands that she had to think through each one. The king's eyebrows lifted slightly, surprise flickering across his face, and then something warmer replaced it, something close to approval. He gestured to the chair across from him. Elira sat. You learn quickly, he signed back, and though she did not know every shape yet, Leora had drilled this particular phrase into her the night before, anticipating she might need it, and Elira understood him without needing to guess. I do not want to be a burden to you, she signed, then spoke the words aloud as well, unsure yet whether that helped or made things more confusing for him. He watched her mouth as she spoke and nodded slightly, confirming he had caught both. You are not a burden, he signed. You are a solution to a problem the council created. That is different. Elira considered this. It was not warm exactly, but it was honest, and honesty had become a rare enough commodity in her life recently that she found herself grateful for it regardless of how it was delivered. May I ask you something? She said aloud, and he nodded. Why me? Out of everyone the crown could have chosen. The king was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on her face, searching for something, and then he reached for a fresh sheet of paper and wrote instead of signing, perhaps wanting to be certain there was no misunderstanding in something this important. Because your file had your sister's name written in the margin, twice, underlined. Whoever prepared it for me wanted me to notice that you had someone worth protecting. I decided that mattered more than anything else on the list. Elira read the words twice, and something in her throat tightened unexpectedly. She had not told anyone at court about Ren beyond Leora, and even that had been in confidence. To learn that the king had known about her sister before she ever arrived at the hold, that it had factored into his choice, felt like discovering a door in a wall she had thought was solid stone. Thank you, she said quietly, and meant it more than she expected to. He gave a small nod, and for a moment they simply sat there, the gallery quiet around them, painted kings and queens watching from the walls, and Elira felt, for the first time since the envoy had knocked on her door, that perhaps this arrangement would not be quite the cold, transactional cage she had braced herself for. Then the door at the far end of the gallery opened, and a man in fine dark robes strode in, tall and narrow-faced, with the kind of smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. Elira did not need an introduction to feel her stomach drop. Something about the set of his shoulders, the way the king's expression shuddered closed the instant the man entered. I told her exactly who this was before a single word was spoken. Your Majesty, the man said, bowing just low enough to satisfy protocol and not a fraction lower. And this must be the future queen, Elira Voss, is it? My apologies, I have not yet had the pleasure. Councilman Thornfield, Elira said, keeping her voice as even as she could manage. Dreas Thornfield's smile widened slightly. You know my name already. How flattering. His eyes moved between her and the king with a calculation so obvious it was almost insulting. I do hope the wedding preparations are proceeding smoothly. The council is most curious about this match. So sudden, so convenient for everyone involved, wouldn't you say? The council will be informed of whatever it needs to know, when it needs to know it, the king signed, and Garrick, who had appeared silently behind Dreas at some point Elira had not noticed, translated the words aloud in a flat, careful tone. Dreas's smile did not falter, but something behind his eyes sharpened. Of course, Your Majesty, always so measured. I only wonder, sometimes, whether measured caution and simple secrecy end up looking the same from where the council stands. His gaze flicked back to Alira. A pleasure, Lady Voss. I look forward to knowing you better. I am certain we will find we have a great deal in common. He left as abruptly as he had entered, and the gallery felt colder for his absence, as though he had taken some of the warmth of the room with him simply by having been in it. Alira let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. He does not like this marriage. The king shook his head slowly, then signed something Garrick did not immediately translate, watching the king's hands with unusual care before speaking. He does not like anything that limits what he can take from this kingdom, Garrick said finally, choosing his words with visible caution. This marriage removes one of his levers. He will not forgive that quickly. Alira thought of Wren's debt, of the pact that had nearly claimed her sister's freedom, and understood with sudden clarity that Dreas Thornfield was not simply an unpleasant courtier to be avoided at social functions. He was danger-wearing expensive robes, and she had just become, without asking for it, one more obstacle standing between him and whatever he wanted from this kingdom. I should go, Alira said, rising from her chair. I have fittings this afternoon. The king nodded, but as she turned to leave, he reached out, not touching her, simply extending his hand palm up in the space between them, a gesture she had learned 2 nights before from Leora's small worn book. It meant, roughly, wait, there is more. She waited. He signed slowly, making certain she caught every shape. Whatever he says to you, do not let it become truth just because he says it with confidence. Confidence is not the same as honesty. Alira nodded, surprised again by the plainness of the warning, the care behind it. I will remember that. She left the gallery with her heart beating faster than it had in days, not from fear this time, or not only from fear, but from the strange, unsettling realization that the man she had agreed to marry for purely practical reasons was turning out to be someone far more careful, far more watchful, and far more decent than she had allowed herself to expect. It made the road ahead no less dangerous. Dreas Thornfield's smile alone had told her that much. But it made her feel, for the first time since the envoy's knock 3 days before, that she might not be walking that road entirely alone. That evening, Fenna arrived for what was meant to be a final etiquette lesson before the wedding, but spent most of the hour instead quietly warning Alira about the different factions within the court, who could be trusted with small confidences, and who could not be trusted with anything at all. Dreas Thornfield's name came up more than once, always accompanied by the same careful, weighted pause, as though even speaking it too freely might summon consequences. Watch what you say near open doors, Fenna told her, packing away her things at the end of the lesson. This hold has more listening ears than any of us can account for. Alira thought of the note the king had sent her. Ask plainly. I will always answer plainly in return, and wondered how a man built on such openness survived in a court built so thoroughly on secrets. She did not have an answer yet, but she intended, standing at the edge of her wedding day, to find out. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and still, the kind of quiet that felt like the whole valley was holding its breath. Alira stood in front of a tall mirror while Leora fastened the last of the buttons down her back, and she barely recognized the woman staring out at her, dressed in pale silver silk, her hair pinned in a style far more elegant than anything she had worn in her life before this one. You look every part a queen, Leora said softly. I do not feel like one, Alira answered. Good, Leora said, surprising her. The ones who feel like it too quickly are usually the ones who forget what it cost to get there. The ceremony was held in the Hold's great chapel, its stone walls carved with the sigils of every royal house that had ever ruled this land, and the pews were filled with nobles Alira did not know, all of them watching her walk the aisle with the same calculating attention Dreas Thornfield had shown her in the gallery 2 days before. She kept her eyes forward, on the king waiting at the altar, dressed in deep formal gray with a thin circlet of silver across his brow, and she reminded herself, step after step, that this was for Wren, only for Wren, and that the eyes of strangers meant nothing beside her sister's safety. The priest spoke the traditional words, and when it came time for vows, Alira turned to face the king directly, remembering everything Leora had drilled into her over the last 3 days. She signed her vows instead of speaking them, slow, deliberate, occasionally fumbling a shape and having to correct herself, painfully aware of the entire court watching her struggle through gestures she had only learned days before. The king did not look away from her hands, not once. Not even when she faltered. When she finished, clumsy but complete, something shifted in his expression, something that was not quite a smile but sat close beside one, and he signed his own vows back to her with the same careful attention, making certain, even in this most public of moments, that she understood every word. Neither of them signed anything about love. The vows spoke of duty, of protection, of the kingdom's future, of promises kept between a king and his people through the union of a crown. Illyra noticed the absence keenly, and judging by the flicker of something in the king's eyes as he finished his own vows, so did he. Neither of them said the word, because neither of them meant it, not yet, and pretending otherwise in front of a chapel full of watching nobles would have been its own kind of dangerous lie. The court noticed the omission too. Illyra caught Lady Elsbeth exchanging a look with a woman beside her, a small, satisfied smile passing between them, as though the missing word confirmed something they had already decided about this marriage. Illyra told herself it did not matter what they thought. She had not married for their approval. She had married for a debt cleared and a sister saved, and no amount of court whispering could undo that. When the priest finally pronounced them wed, the king reached for her hand, the first time he had touched her since her arrival at the hold, and his grip was steady, warm, careful, as though he understood exactly how much she was carrying beneath the calm surface she had worked so hard to build. He raised their joined hands for the court to see, and the applause that followed felt, to Illyra, distant and hollow, like something happening to someone else in a story she was merely watching unfold. The feast that followed stretched long into the evening, course after course, toast after toast, and Illyra sat beside her new husband at the head table, exchanging small, careful signs between courses, learning the shapes of everyday conversation in real time, in front of an audience that never stopped watching. Dreas Thornfield approached only once, raising his cup in a toast so smooth and courteous that only someone looking closely would have noticed the challenge folded inside it. "To the crown," Dreas said, "and to whatever, or whoever, keeps it standing." The king's expression did not change, but Illyra felt his hand tighten very slightly around hers beneath the table, a small, private acknowledgement that the toast had landed exactly where Dreas intended it to. Later, long after the feast had ended and the court had finally dispersed to their own chambers, Illyra found herself alone with the king for the first time since the ceremony, in a private sitting room adjoining what were now, officially, her rooms as well as his. The fires had burned low, and the silence between them felt different than it had in the gallery 2 days before, less careful somehow, though no less uncertain. "Thank you," Illyra signed, the shapes coming more naturally now after a full day of practice, "for not making today harder than it needed to be." The king considered this for a long moment before responding, his hands moving slow and deliberate in the firelight. "You carried more of today than anyone in that chapel understood. I saw it. I wanted you to know that I saw it." Illyra felt something tighten in her chest, unexpected and unwelcome, a feeling she did not have a name for yet and was not certain she wanted one for. She had walked into this marriage prepared for coldness, for a transaction completed and then largely ignored, two strangers sharing a title and little else. She had not prepared for a man who watched this closely, who noticed what she carried and named it without asking anything of her in return. "I should check on word from home," she said aloud, needing suddenly to be doing something other than sitting in this quiet room feeling things she had not budgeted time or space for. "About my sister, about the debt." The king nodded and rose, crossing to a small writing desk in the corner of the room, and returned with a folded letter, already opened, its seal broken. "Word came this afternoon, before the ceremony," he wrote at the bottom of the same page, having apparently decided writing was faster and clearer than signing for something this important. "Your sister has been informed the debt is cleared. She is safe. I did not want to interrupt the day with it, but I did not want you to spend tonight wondering either." Illyra read the words 3 times, her eyes stinging in a way she refused to acknowledge in front of him, and when she finally looked up, the king was watching her with the same careful attention he had shown her from the very first moment in the great hall, as though her face were something worth reading as closely as any letter. "Thank you," she said again, and this time the words came out rougher than she intended, thick with relief she had been holding at bay for days. The king reached out, not quite touching her, the same open-palmed gesture from the gallery. "Wait, there is more," and then signed slowly, watching to be sure she understood every word. "You do not owe me gratitude for keeping a promise. A king who needs thanks for basic honesty is not much of a king at all." Illyra almost laughed, surprised by the dry humor folded into the statement, and something in the tension of the day finally began to ease out of her shoulders. She did not love this man. She barely knew him, but standing in the firelight of a room that was now, somehow, hers as much as his, she allowed herself, for the first time since the envoy's knock 3 days before her wedding, to believe that whatever else this marriage became, it might not be the cold, calculated cage she had steeled herself to endure. Outside, somewhere beyond the tower walls, the court continued its quiet, constant work of watching and whispering, Andreas Thornfield sat in his own chambers turning over the events of the day, with the patient calculation of a man who had lost a battle, but had not yet decided the war was finished. But inside that small firelit room, for one evening at least, Alira allowed herself to simply breathe, and to hope, cautiously, that the road ahead might hold more than she had braced herself to expect from it. The council chamber doors closed with a heavy sound, and Alira stood outside them, forbidden by protocol from entering while the council conducted what Garrick had called routine business, though nothing about the tension in his shoulders as he stood guard beside her suggested anything routine was happening on the other side of that wood. "What are they discussing?" she asked quietly. "Border patrols, mostly," Garrick said, though his eyes did not leave the door. "And you, I imagine, Your Grace? Councilman Thornfield has requested a formal review of the marriage documents." Alira's stomach dropped. Why would he need to review anything? The marriage was legal. The debt was cleared according to the law. "He does not need a reason, Your Grace. He only needs a question loud enough that other council members feel compelled to ask it alongside him. That is how men like Andreas Thornfield operate. They do not attack directly. They plant doubt, and let the doubt do the work for them." It had been 2 weeks since the wedding, 2 weeks of Alira learning the rhythms of the hold, improving her signs daily under Leora's patient instruction, sitting beside the king through long council sessions she mostly observed rather than participated in, watching Andreas Thornfield watch her back with the same calculating patience he had shown in the gallery on the second day. He had not confronted her again directly. He did not need to. His presence alone, at every gathering, every meal, every council session, was its own quiet pressure, a constant reminder that somewhere behind his courteous smile, he was building something, patiently, piece by piece, and Alira did not yet know what shape it would take when it was finished. The chamber doors opened an hour later, and the council members filed out in 2s and 3s, most avoiding her eyes entirely, though Andreas paused directly in front of her, his smile as smooth and untroubled as ever. "Lady Voss," he said, "or should I say, Your Grace, now that the title has settled properly. I do hope you will forgive the council's diligence. It is nothing personal, simply thorough governance." "Thorough governance regarding what, exactly?" Alira asked, keeping her voice as level as she could manage. "Oh, small matters. The timeline of your marriage, the precise circumstances of your sister's debt and how quickly it was resolved. These things simply need documentation, for the sake of the historical record. I am certain everything will prove perfectly in order." His eyes flicked briefly toward the chamber, where the king still remained, speaking privately with a scribe. "Though it does raise an interesting question, does it not, why a marriage arranged so quickly, for reasons so convenient, would need such urgent secrecy in the first place? One almost wonders what a slower, more transparent process might have revealed." "There is nothing to reveal," Alira said. "I married the king. My sister's debt was paid. That is the whole of it." "Of course," Andreas said, in a tone that suggested he believed nothing of the sort. "Well, I look forward to the council's findings. Good day, Your Grace." He walked away, and Alira stood there with her hands clenched at her sides, aware that whatever calm 2 weeks of settling into this new life had built inside her, it had just been cracked, deliberately, by a man who understood exactly how much damage a single well-placed question could do. She found Leora later that evening, mending a torn hem in the small sitting room that had become, over the last 2 weeks, something like a refuge for the two of them. "He is asking about the debt," Alira said, not bothering with any preamble, "about how quickly it was cleared. What is he trying to find, Leora?" Leora's needle paused mid-stitch. "He is trying to find a thread to pull, Your Grace. If he can prove the crown moved with unusual speed to erase a Thornfield debt specifically, right before a royal marriage, he can argue the marriage was arranged under duress, or worse, that the king used crown resources improperly to benefit a private arrangement. Either accusation could be used to challenge the legitimacy of your position here. Can he prove any of that?" "I do not know," Leora admitted. "But Councilman Thornfield does not need proof so much as he needs enough smoke that the rest of the council starts wondering where the fire is." Alira thought of Ren, safe now in the valley, unaware entirely of the storm building around the marriage that had saved her, and felt a fresh wave of protective fear rise in her chest. If Andreas succeeded in unraveling this, if he found a way to prove the marriage improper, would the debt reopen? Would Ren's safety, so recently secured, simply evaporate along with everything else? She sought out the king that night, finding him in his study surrounded by papers, the same posture she had first seen him in through the gallery window weeks before. He looked up as she entered, and something in her face must have told him immediately that this was not a casual visit. because he set down his quill at once and gave her his full attention. "Dreas is asking questions about the debt," she signed, her hands moving faster now, more fluent than they had been on her wedding day, urgency sharpening every shape. About how quickly it was cleared. He implied the marriage might not hold up to scrutiny. Can he actually do anything with this? The king's expression grew still, unreadable in the particular way she had learned meant he was thinking carefully before responding, weighing exactly how much to say and how to say it plainly. He reached for a fresh page. "Dreas has wanted a reason to challenge my authority since before you arrived. This is not new. He will use whatever thread presents itself. The debt is simply the thread currently available to him." "Should I be afraid?" Alira asked aloud, watching his face rather than the page. He looked up at her, and after a moment, he shook his head, slow and definite, and signed, watching to be sure she followed every word. "Not of the debt. It was cleared properly, by the crown's own authority, which no council vote can undo after the fact. Be wary of Dreas, not of the marriage." Alira wanted to believe him completely, and mostly she did, but a small cold seed of doubt had been planted regardless, the kind that Dreas Thornfield had built an entire career out of planting in exactly this way. She sat across from the king in the quiet study, the fire crackling low in the hearth, and for a long moment neither of them signed anything at all, simply sitting together, in the kind of silence that had, over 2 weeks, become less unsettling and more familiar, though it did nothing yet to dissolve the fear sitting heavy in her chest. "There is something else," Alira said finally, choosing her words with care. "I do not fully understand why he hates you so much, or why the council even allows him this much power to begin with, if he is this determined to undermine you." The king considered this for a long moment before writing his answer, and Alira noticed, not for the first time, how much more he seemed willing to say on paper than he ever risked signing where a translator like Garrick might overhear. "His family lost standing when my father took the throne over Dreas's own grandfather, decades ago. He has spent his whole life believing the crown belongs to his bloodline instead of mine. He cannot challenge that directly, so he chips at the edges instead, hoping enough small cracks will eventually bring down the whole wall." Alira read this twice, and something in it settled into place, a piece of the pattern she had been trying to understand since her first day at the hold. This was not simply a councilman who disliked an unfamiliar new queen. This was a man fighting a war generations old, using whatever weapon presented itself, and she had just become, entirely without meaning to, one of the newest weapons available to him, aimed squarely at the throne he believed should have been his family's all along. "What do we do?" she asked. The king held her gaze for a long moment, something steady and certain in his eyes despite the danger they were both clearly aware of now, and he signed slowly, deliberately, each shape landing with the weight of a promise rather than a guess. "We give him nothing to find, we wait, and when he finally overreaches, because men like him always overreach eventually, we will be ready." Alira nodded, though the fear in her chest did not fully disappear. Not that night, and not in the nights that followed. As she watched Dreas Thornfield continue his patient, careful circling, waiting for whatever mistake, whatever crack, would finally let him inside the walls the king had built so carefully around the both of them. What Alira did not know, and would not learn for some time yet, was how far back the king's involvement in her situation truly reached. 3 weeks before the envoy ever knocked on her door, King Kaelan Ashgrove had been sitting in this same study, reviewing a list of names his advisor Corwin had prepared. Women of no political standing, no rival family, no ties that could be used against the crown, each one a possible answer to the council's growing pressure for a queen. Corwin had laid 12 names across the desk that evening, most accompanied by a single line of background information, tidy and impersonal. Kaelan had read through them once, twice, finding nothing that distinguished one name from another, until he reached the 11th page and found, scrawled in the margin beside the name Alira Voss, a note in Corwin's own careful handwriting. Sister, Ren Voss, 19, currently at risk of a Thornfield debt claim, urgent. He had sat with that page longer than any of the others. It was not sentiment, not exactly, though he would not have denied that something in it moved him. It was strategy as much as anything else. A woman with a sister in danger from Thornfield's own pack was a woman who would understand, immediately and completely, exactly what kind of enemy Dreas Thornfield truly was. She would not need convincing. She would not need years to learn caution around him the way some sheltered noble daughter might. She would arrive already knowing. But it was not only strategy, and Kaelan had been honest enough with himself, alone in this study, to admit that much. There was something in the small underlined note, sister, urgent, that told him this woman understood the particular weight of protecting someone else at cost to herself. a weight he recognized because he had carried a version of it his entire life, first for his mother, in the years before the crown passed to him, and later for an entire kingdom that mostly did not know how much protecting it required. He had instructed Corwin to quietly arrange payment of the Thornfield debt before the envoy was even sent, a smaller, separate transaction, deliberately obscured within routine crown expenditures so that no direct line could be drawn between the payment and the marriage proposal that would follow. It would not fully clear the debt, not the way the formal marriage contract would, but it would ensure that even if Alira Voss refused the marriage entirely, her sister would not be dragged onto Thornfield land while the crown's larger offer was still being considered. He never told Alira this. He let her believe the debt had been cleared entirely through the marriage contract, exactly as the envoy had presented it, because he understood something about her that took him little time to see clearly. Once she arrived, she needed the lie to be complete in order to survive believing it. A woman who thought she alone had bought her sister's safety, at the cost of her own future, would walk through that marriage with a particular kind of resolve, a fierce, protective clarity that would serve her well in a court built almost entirely on manipulation and half-truths. He let her lie stand because it cost him nothing to let it stand, and it gave her something solid to hold on to during a transition that would have terrified anyone. What he had not expected, watching her those first weeks, was how much he would come to respect the woman underneath the lie. He had expected gratitude, perhaps resentment, perhaps simple exhausted resignation. He had not expected a woman who learned an entire language of signs in under a week out of pure determination not to misunderstand him again. He had not expected someone who noticed, in the gallery, that Dreas Thornfield's smile did not reach his eyes, and drew the correct conclusions from it faster than most of his own council members ever had. When Dreas began circling the marriage with his careful, patient questions, Kaelin was not surprised. He had expected this from the very beginning, had built the quiet secondary payment specifically to survive exactly this kind of scrutiny, knowing that if Dreas ever dug deep enough to find the crown's involvement in clearing the debt, the formal marriage contract would still stand entirely on its own legal merit, untouchable, regardless of what smaller arrangements had come before it. He had not told Alira any of this, not the early payment, not the reasoning behind choosing her name from among 12, not the quiet respect that had grown steadily since her arrival into something he did not yet have a comfortable name for. He told himself there would be time for that conversation later, once the council's current scrutiny passed, once the immediate danger from Dreas settled into something more manageable. He did not yet know how wrong that timeline would prove to be. That evening, after Alira left his study, her fear about Dreas's questions still hanging faintly in the air of the room, Kaelin sat alone reviewing the ledger where the original quiet payment to Thornfield had been recorded, buried 3 pages deep in a section labeled Routine Border Expenditures, disguised well enough that even a careful auditor would need to know exactly what to look for before finding it. He trusted the disguise. He had built it himself, with Corwin's help, specifically to withstand exactly the kind of scrutiny Dreas was currently applying. But he also understood, with the same careful patience that had kept him alive and ruling for 5 years since Ember Ridge took his hearing and nearly took his life along with it, that Dreas Thornfield was not a man who gave up simply because the first search came up empty. He would keep looking, he would keep circling, and eventually, if given enough time and enough motivation, he would find something, even if that something was manufactured rather than real. Kaelin closed the ledger and locked it back inside the small drawer where it lived, and he sat for a long while in the quiet of his study, thinking not about Dreas, not about the council, but about the woman 2 rooms away who believed she alone had bought her sister's freedom through a marriage she had entered purely out of desperation. He thought about how she had signed her wedding vows, clumsy and determined, never once looking away from his hands despite the entire court watching her fumble through unfamiliar shapes. He thought about the fierce, protective note in her voice whenever her sister's name came up, and the particular way she had thanked him, twice now, for simple honesty, as though honesty were a gift rather than a baseline expectation any decent person should meet. He did not know yet what this feeling growing quietly in his chest deserved to be called. He only knew that he had chosen her name from among 12 for reasons that had started as strategy and had, somewhere in these first weeks, become something considerably more complicated than that, and he intended, whatever Dreas Thornfield eventually managed to uncover or manufacture, to make certain that whatever came next did not cost Alira Voss the safety she had traded everything to secure. Somewhere in the tower above, unaware of any of this, Alira sat with her own candle burning low, writing a careful, cheerful letter to Ren about court life, leaving out entirely the growing danger circling the marriage that had saved her sister's freedom, because she, too, had decided that some truths were better carried alone, at least for now. at least until she understood more clearly exactly what kind of storm was building around her. Neither of them yet knew how soon that storm would arrive, or how completely it would test the fragile trust they had only just begun building between two people who had married as strangers and were only now, slowly, carefully, beginning to become something else entirely. The rider arrived at dawn, his horse lathered white with sweat, and the sound of his shouting reached Alira's tower window before Garrick even reached her door to deliver the news properly. "Your Grace," Garrick said, breathless from the stairs, "there has been an attack near the southern border, a village close to the old Thornfield lands." Alira's blood turned to ice. "Which village?" "Millbrook, Your Grace." Millbrook, the valley where she had grown up, where Wren still lived, in the small house at the end of the muddy lane, believing herself finally safe after weeks of watching the road for Thornfield riders who were never supposed to come again. "Is my sister among the wounded?" Alira demanded, already moving toward her wardrobe, pulling on the first dress her hands found without any thought toward propriety or fashion. "The reports are still coming in, Your Grace. It does not appear to be a full raid, more a small band, poorly disguised, testing the border defenses. But Millbrook sits close enough to the disputed line that is my sister's village," Alira said, cutting him off, her hands shaking now as she fastened buttons she could barely see through the sudden blur in her eyes. "Take me to the king, now." She found Kalen already in the war room, bent over a map with Corwin and two border captains, his expression carved from stone in a way Alira had not seen since her arrival at the hold. He looked up the moment she entered, and something in his face shifted immediately, softening just slightly despite the crisis in front of him, as though her presence alone changed the register of the room even in the middle of an emergency. "My sister," Alira said, not bothering with any greeting at all. "Is she safe, do you know?" The king held up a hand, asking for patience, and gestured to Corwin, who translated quickly while the king signed. "Riders are already moving toward Millbrook. We received word of the attack less than an hour ago. We do not yet have confirmation of casualties." "Send me with them." "Absolutely not," Corwin said, before catching himself and glancing at the king, who had not signed anything yet, waiting instead, watching Alira's face with an intensity that suggested he understood exactly what she was feeling, and did not need Corwin to answer for him. Kalen signed something slow and deliberate, and Corwin, chastened, translated it precisely. "You will not go yourself. It is too dangerous. Andreas would use any excuse to claim the queen abandoned her post during a crisis. But I will send my fastest riders, and I will send Garrick personally to oversee the search for your sister specifically. You have my word she will be found." Alira wanted to argue, every instinct in her screaming to move, to act, to be somewhere closer to the danger than this war room full of maps and careful strategy, but she understood, even through the panic, that the king was right. A queen riding off toward a border skirmish would hand Andreas exactly the kind of scandal he had been hunting for weeks. "Please," Alira said, her voice cracking on the single word, all her careful composure finally giving way. "She is all I have left." Something in the king's face changed at that, some final wall coming down, and he crossed the room to her directly, took both her hands in his, and signed slowly, making absolutely certain she caught every word through the tears now falling freely down her face. "I know what it is to have almost nothing left, and to guard it with everything you have. I will not let anything happen to her while I have the power to prevent it. That is not a promise I make lightly. Believe me." Alira gripped his hands back, hard, and nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat, and the king held her gaze for one more long moment, before releasing her hands and turning back to the map, signing rapid instructions to his captains, dispatching riders with an efficiency that would have reassured her completely if her heart were not still hammering with fear for Wren. The hours that followed were the longest of Alira's life. She paced the length of her sitting room until Leora finally sat her down bodily and forced tea into her hands, though Alira barely tasted it, her eyes fixed on the window, on the road below, waiting for any sign of returning riders. Word trickled in slowly throughout the day, fragments and rumors before anything solid. The attack had been small, poorly organized, more a probe of the border than a true assault. The village had suffered some damage to outlying buildings, but the raiders had been driven off before reaching the main square. Still no word specifically about Wren. It was nearly evening when Garrick finally returned, dust-covered and exhausted, and Alira was on her feet the moment he entered the room, searching his face for the answer before he could even speak it. "She is safe," Garrick said immediately, understanding exactly what she needed to hear first. "Frightened, and the house took some damage from a stray fire, but she is unharmed. I brought her back with me, Your Grace. She is being settled into guest quarters as we speak." Alira's legs nearly gave out beneath her. relief crashing through her so completely that she had to grip the back of a chair to stay upright. "She is here, at the hold." "His Majesty ordered it," Garrick said. "He decided, given the proximity of the attack to Thornfield lands, that your sister would be safer under direct crown protection than left alone in the valley, at least until the border situation is fully resolved." Illyra did not wait for further explanation. She moved past Garrick and ran, through the halls of the hold in a manner entirely unbefitting a queen, arriving breathless at the guest quarters where Wren stood waiting, still travel-worn, still frightened, but alive, whole, safe. The sisters collided into an embrace that neither of them seemed willing to break, and Illyra held on the way she had wanted to since the moment Garrick had first said the word Millbrook that morning, feeling Wren's heartbeat against her own, steady, present, real. "I thought," Illyra started, and could not finish the sentence. "I know," Wren said, her voice muffled against Illyra's shoulder. "I know. I am here. I am all right." Later that night, once Wren had been settled, fed, and finally coaxed into an exhausted sleep, Illyra found her way back to the king's study, where he sat reviewing reports from the border captains, the same careful stillness in his posture that she had learned meant he was working through something difficult. He looked up when she entered, and she crossed the room without hesitation, sitting in the chair across from his desk, meeting his eyes directly. "Thank you," she signed, the shapes coming easily now, fluent after weeks of practice. "For bringing her here. For keeping your word." He set down his quill and considered her for a long moment before responding. "You do not need to thank me for that. I told you I would protect what mattered to you. I meant it." "I know you meant it," Illyra said aloud, something in her voice softer than she had allowed it to be in weeks. "I am only now understanding how much you meant it." The king's expression shifted, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and for a moment Illyra thought he might say something more, might explain something about the depth of that promise she did not yet fully understand, but instead he simply nodded, once, and returned his attention to the reports in front of him, leaving whatever unspoken thing had passed between them to sit, unresolved, in the quiet of the study. Illyra did not press him further. She had learned enough, in these last weeks, to recognize when a silence held meaning rather than absence, and she left the study that night carrying both the enormous relief of her sister's safety and a new, unfamiliar warmth toward the man who had secured it, a warmth she was not yet ready to examine too closely, not with Dreas Thornfield's shadow still hanging over everything they had built so carefully together. Dreas Thornfield requested a full council session 8 days after Wren arrived at the hold, and the formal summons that reached Illyra's chambers that morning carried a weight that made her hands go cold the moment she read it. The council demanded the Queen's presence, along with the King's, to address what the summons called irregularities in the Crown's financial records concerning the settlement of a private debt prior to the royal marriage.
"He found it,"
Illyra said, staring at the paper.
"The early payment."
"He found it." Leora, standing beside her, looked equally grim. "It seems so, Your Grace." Illyra sought out the king immediately, finding him already reviewing the same summons in his study, his expression carved into the particular stillness she now recognized as controlled fury, rather than calm. "Is it true?" she signed, needing to know before anything else happened. "Was there an early payment, before the marriage contract?" The king looked at her for a long moment, and something passed behind his eyes that told her, even before he answered, that the answer was yes, and that he had never told her about it. "Yes," he signed simply. "I arranged it before the envoy ever reached your door. I wanted your sister protected, regardless of whether you agreed to marry me." Illyra felt something complicated rise in her chest, gratitude tangled together with a sharp, unexpected sting of having been kept in the dark about something this significant. "You never told me. I did not think it mattered how the safety arrived, only that it did." The king signed, and then, seeing something in her face, added more carefully, "I should have told you. I understand that now, but there is no time to address that properly before this session, and I need you to understand something more urgent first. Dreas will use this payment to argue the Crown acted improperly, using state funds for a private matter, potentially even suggesting the marriage itself was constructed to hide financial impropriety, rather than address it. It is a serious accusation, whatever the truth behind it." "Can he prove it?" Illyra asked. "He has the ledger entry. Corwin disguised it well, but not perfectly enough, apparently, to survive whatever methods Dreas used to find it. Proof of intent is harder to establish than proof of the payment itself, but a hostile council does not always require certainty. Sometimes doubt is enough. The council chamber that afternoon was fuller than Alira had ever seen it, every seat occupied, tension thick enough that she could feel it pressing against her skin the moment she and the king entered together. Dreas stood at the center of the chamber floor, a folded document in his hand, his expression composed into something that mimicked genuine concern far too smoothly to be believed. "Your Majesty, Your Grace," he began, bowing with exaggerated formality. "I regret bringing such a matter before this council, but my duty compels me. I have discovered evidence that crown funds were used to settle a private debt belonging to Lady Alira Voss's sister, weeks before the royal marriage was formally announced. This raises serious questions. Was the marriage itself constructed to obscure this transaction? Was crown money improperly diverted for personal benefit before any legitimate arrangement existed between the parties?" Murmurs rippled through the assembled council, and Alira felt her pulse hammering in her throat, watching Dreas hold up the very ledger page Kaelin had described. The ink faded slightly, but the entry unmistakably clear once you knew exactly what to look for. "I move," Dreas continued, "that this council formally investigate the circumstances of this payment and suspend recognition of the marriage contract pending the outcome of that investigation." More murmurs, louder now, several council members nodding slowly, and Alira understood in that moment exactly how close Dreas had come to succeeding, how carefully he had built this moment, waiting weeks for precisely the right session, the right audience, the right combination of circumstance, to make his accusation land with maximum damage. The king stepped forward before anyone else could speak, and the chamber fell quiet immediately, the particular silence that always accompanied him regardless of whether he had spoken a word yet. He held out his hand for the ledger page, and Dreas, after a moment's hesitation, handed it over. Kaelin studied the page for a long moment, and then, without any signed explanation to Corwin, without any warning to Alira standing beside him, he walked directly to the great hearth burning at the side of the chamber, and dropped the page into the flames. The chamber erupted into shocked exclamations, Dreas's composed mask finally cracking into genuine outrage. "Your Majesty, that document was evidence before this council." The king turned, and Corwin, scrambling to keep pace with the rapid signs that followed, translated as quickly as he could manage. "That document was forged. I have never seen that specific page before this moment, and the handwriting does not match my treasury clerk's hand. If Councilman Thornfield wishes to bring forged evidence before this council, he may explain to the assembled body exactly where he acquired it, and why." Alira's breath caught. She knew, with absolute certainty, that the king was lying, that the ledger page had been entirely real, that he had just destroyed genuine evidence and declared it false in front of the very council Dreas had assembled to condemn them both. She kept her face perfectly still, trusting him completely in a moment that offered her no other choice, and watched Dreas's expression shift from outrage to something more calculating, recognizing, perhaps, that he had just lost his only tangible proof and had no way to recover it without revealing methods of his own that he likely did not want examined too closely either. "Forged," Dreas repeated, his voice tight. "Your Majesty, I assure you, that document came directly from Crown Archives. Then Councilman Thornfield should have no difficulty explaining how he gained unauthorized access to Crown Archives." Kaelin signed, Corwin's voice carrying the words across the silent chamber, "which is itself a serious offense this council might wish to investigate, if he insists on pursuing this matter further." The chamber held its breath, and Alira watched something in Dreas's face falter, just slightly, the calculation shifting visibly, as he recognized the trap closing around his own accusation. He had come to destroy the marriage and instead found himself, in the space of a few sentences, facing a counter-accusation of unauthorized access to Crown records, an offense far more serious than anything he had attempted to pin on the Crown. "I withdraw the motion," Dreas said finally, through visibly gritted teeth. "For now." "Then this session is concluded," the king signed, and the council dispersed in a wave of hushed, urgent conversation, several members casting uncertain glances between Dreas and the throne as they filed out, clearly unsure which side had actually won today's confrontation. Alira waited until they were alone in the corridor outside the chamber, before turning to the king, her hands shaking now that the immediate danger had passed. "You lied. In front of the entire council. You said the payment never happened." "I said the document was forged," Kaelin signed carefully. "Which was a lie, yes, but the payment was real, and I would make that same payment again without hesitation, regardless of what it cost me today to protect it. You could have simply admitted the truth, explained your reasons." and handed Dreas exactly the confirmation he needed to pursue a formal investigation, one that could have dragged on for months, casting doubt over your position and your sister's safety the entire time it lasted. The king's expression softened slightly, something careful and searching in his eyes as he studied her face. I did not lie to protect myself, Alira. I lied to protect you, and I would do it again tomorrow if it came to that. Alira stood in the quiet corridor, processing the enormity of what had just happened, the risk the king had taken, burning evidence in front of an entire hostile council, staking his own credibility on a lie meant entirely to shield her and her sister from Dreas Thornfield's calculated attack. She thought of every small kindness since her arrival, the note about honesty, the quiet payment made before he had any guarantee she would even accept the marriage, the riders sent immediately to secure Ren's safety, and something in her chest, some final wall she had been maintaining without fully realizing it, finally gave way. "Thank you," she signed. And then, because the shapes felt insufficient for what she actually meant, she reached out and took his hand, holding it firmly in both of hers, meeting his eyes directly. "Truly, thank you." The king held her gaze for a long moment, something warm and unguarded passing across his face, and though neither of them signed the word that had been so carefully absent from their wedding vows weeks before, something had shifted between them in that quiet corridor, something neither of them was ready yet to name aloud, but something real nonetheless, growing steadily beneath everything Dreas Thornfield had tried, and failed, to burn down. The days following the council session settled into something quieter, though not entirely peaceful, the memory of Dreas Thornfield's failed accusation lingering in every hallway conversation, and every careful glance exchanged among the nobles who had witnessed it. Alira noticed a shift in how the court treated her, less open suspicion now, replaced by something more like cautious respect, as though surviving Dreas's attack had earned her a place at the hold that the wedding ceremony alone had not. She found the king in the gallery again, in the same spot by the window where she had first sat across from him weeks earlier, and this time she did not hesitate before joining him. "I need to ask you something," Alira signed, settling into the chair across from his small table. "And I need you to answer plainly, the way you promised the very first week I arrived." The king set down his quill, giving her his full attention, and nodded once, waiting. "Did you know," she signed slowly, choosing each shape with care, "when you chose my name from that list, that I would come to matter to you the way I think I have started to? Or was that something that happened after?" The king considered the question for a long moment, his eyes searching her face with the same intensity she remembered from their very first meeting in the great hall, when she had mistaken his stillness for coldness, and had been so entirely wrong about it. He reached for a fresh page rather than signing, and Alira understood, watching him write, that this was a truth he wanted to be absolutely certain she received without any possibility of misunderstanding. "I chose your name because your file told me you understood what it meant to protect someone at any cost to yourself. That was strategy, and I will not pretend otherwise. But everything since then, watching you learn an entire language in a matter of days out of pure determination, watching you stand in that council chamber today, without flinching even when I made a choice I did not explain to you beforehand, watching you hold your sister the night she arrived here like she was the only solid thing left in the world, none of that was strategy. That grew on its own, and it grew faster than I expected it to, and I did not know how to tell you without it sounding like another calculated move in an arrangement that started as exactly that." Alira read the page twice, her throat tight, and when she looked up, the king was watching her with a rare, unguarded vulnerability, the careful composure he wore for the court entirely absent in this quiet gallery with only painted kings and queens as witnesses. "I did not marry you for love," Alira said aloud, watching his face carefully as she spoke, wanting to be certain he caught every word from her lips as well as understood the honesty behind them. "I want you to know that I know that, and that I am not pretending otherwise now, just because things have shifted. I married you because I was desperate, and you were the only door that opened when I needed one." The king nodded, accepting this without flinching from it. "But I do not think what is growing between us now is desperation anymore," Alira continued. "I do not entirely know what to call it yet, but I do not think it is nothing either." The king reached out, the same open-palmed gesture she had learned meant wait, there is more. Except this time he did not simply wait for her attention before signing. Instead, slowly, giving her every chance to pull back if she wanted to, he closed the distance between them, and rested his palm gently against her cheek, watching her eyes the entire time for any sign of hesitation. Alira did not pull back. They sat like that for a long moment, in the quiet gallery, surrounded by the painted eyes of kings and queens who had ruled this land long before either of them, and something passed between them that needed no signs at all to communicate. No careful written pages. Nothing but the simple, steady presence of two people who had started as strangers bound by necessity, and had found, slowly and carefully, something neither of them had expected to find in a marriage built on a lie. Word came a week later that Dreas Thornfield had quietly resigned his council seat, citing personal health concerns that convinced absolutely no one at court. Though nobody pressed the matter further either, understanding well enough that a man who had staked his credibility on forged evidence and lost had little choice but to disappear from view before the consequences caught up with him more publicly. His PAC's remaining claims across the region were reviewed and, one by one, dissolved under new crown oversight, and the shadow that had hung over Alira's marriage since her very first day at the hold, finally, slowly, began to lift. Wren remained at the hold in the months that followed, given her own small chambers and, eventually, a position helping oversee the Crown's efforts to support villages recovering from border skirmishes. Work she took to with the same reckless energy that had once landed her in debt to begin with, now channeled toward something that actually mattered. She and Alira spoke often, long evenings by the fire, catching each other up on everything the distance and danger of the past months had kept them from sharing properly, and slowly, the fear that had defined so much of their relationship since their parents' deaths began to soften into something calmer, something closer to simple, ordinary sisterhood. Alira continued learning signs long after she needed to, not out of obligation now but out of genuine desire to understand every shade of meaning available in the silent language her husband had built his entire way of communicating around. She learned to catch the small differences in his expressions that even the most careful sign could not fully capture, the particular warmth in his eyes when Wren made him laugh with some story from the valley, the fierce protectiveness that flashed across his face whenever anyone at court still dared to speak carelessly about his hearing. One evening, months after the council session that had nearly destroyed everything, Alira found herself again in the small firelit sitting room where they had spent their wedding night, except this time there was no fear sitting beneath the quiet, no careful performance of a marriage built purely on necessity. She sat across from Kaelin, both of them working through separate reports in comfortable silence, and at some point, without either of them planning it, she reached across the small distance between their chairs and took his hand, simply because she wanted to, not because any ceremony or crisis demanded it. He looked up, surprised for only a moment, and then something soft crossed his face, and he set down his own papers entirely, turning his full attention to her instead. "I never thought," Alira signed slowly, "that the lie I told myself to survive this marriage would end up becoming something true." The king studied her for a long moment, and then he signed back, simple and certain, the words landing with all the weight of a promise, finally spoken aloud rather than merely implied through months of quiet actions. "Some of the truest things start as lies we tell ourselves to survive. What matters is what we build once we stop needing the lie at all." Alira smiled, something warm and unguarded, and outside the tower windows, the valley stretched out peaceful and settled beneath a clear evening sky. Thornfield's shadow finally gone from it, her sister safe within these walls, and beside her, a man she had married as a stranger, and had slowly, carefully, honestly, come to love. A full year passed before the kingdom finally felt, to Alira, like something she belonged to rather than something she had simply been placed inside of, and the morning she chose to walk the valley road back toward Millbrook alone, without guards trailing 3 steps behind her, felt like the clearest proof of exactly how far that year had carried her. The village had rebuilt since the attack, new roofs replacing the ones scorched by Thornfield's failed raiders, and the small house at the end of the muddy lane stood freshly repaired, thanks to crown funds Alira had quietly arranged the moment her position allowed her the authority to do so. She had not told Wren about the repairs until they were finished, wanting the gift to arrive complete rather than promised, and the look on her sister's face when she first saw the mended roof and the sturdy new door had been worth every bit of the careful planning it required. Alira stood in the lane now, looking at the house that had once held nothing but fear and hopeless late-night arithmetic, and she found it strange, in a good way, how ordinary the memory felt from this distance. The desperation that had driven her to accept a stranger's marriage proposal without hesitation no longer sat in her chest like a wound. It had become, instead, simply the first chapter of a story that had turned out far better than she had any right to expect. She returned to Ashgrove Hold by evening, and found Kaelin waiting for her in the gallery, the same spot where so much of what mattered between them had first taken careful shape. He rose when she entered, crossing the room to meet her, and signed a simple question before she had even fully closed the distance between them. "How did it feel?" Alira considered the question seriously, the way she had learned to consider all his questions, because he never asked anything he did not genuinely want a full answer to. Like closing a door gently, she signed back, instead of slamming it shut. I do not need to be afraid of that road anymore. I do not need to run from it either. It is simply where I come from now, nothing more frightening than that. The king's expression softened, and he reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in the easy, familiar way that had replaced the careful, tentative touches of their first months together. The council, in the year since Dreas Thornfield's quiet disappearance from public life, had settled into a steadier rhythm, fewer factions circling for advantage, more genuine work accomplished in service of the kingdom rather than in service of ambitions dressed up as governance. Elira had taken on responsibilities of her own beyond simply standing beside the throne at ceremonies, working alongside Ren on efforts to support villages along the border, using her own hard-won understanding of debt and desperation to shape policies that made it harder for pacts like Thornfield's had once been to trap desperate families in agreements they could never hope to escape. Leora had been promoted to oversee the Queen's household entirely, a position she filled with the same quiet competence she had shown from Elira's very first night at the hold, and Garrick continued his steady, watchful service as captain of the guard, though the wariness that had once colored every interaction at court had softened considerably now that the immediate threats surrounding the marriage had passed. That evening, after the day's business had settled and the hold grew quiet around them, Elira and Kaelin walked together along the same wall where guards had once stood at rigid attention on the night of her arrival, both of them older now in ways that had nothing to do with the simple passage of time. She thought of the frightened, rehearsing woman who had climbed out of that first carriage a year before, practicing a soft smile and downcast eyes for an audience she assumed would need convincing, and she thought of how completely unnecessary all that careful performance had turned out to be in the end, with this particular man. "Do you regret any of it?" Kaelin asked, signing slowly as they walked, watching her face as much as her hands. "The way it started, the lie you told yourself to survive it." Elira thought about the question honestly. The way their entire relationship had been built, brick by brick, on exactly that kind of honesty, once the initial fear had finally settled. "No," she signed back, certain of it in a way she had not been certain of much when she first arrived. "The lie got me here, and here turned out to be worth arriving at, more than I ever let myself hope for, back when I signed that first contract in my kitchen, with a candle burning down to nothing." Kaelin stopped walking and turned to face her fully, the evening light catching the silver at his brow. Softer now, more familiar than it had been on their wedding day, and he signed something simple, something he had signed to her many times over the past year, but that never once lost its weight in the repeating. "I am glad it was you. Out of everyone on that list, out of everyone the crown could have chosen, I am glad, every day, that it turned out to be you." Elira smiled, and reached up to touch his face the way he had once touched hers in the quiet gallery, and neither of them needed any further words, spoken or signed, to understand exactly what the year behind them had built, and exactly what the years ahead of them now promised to hold. Below the wall, the valley stretched out calm and settled in the fading light, Ren's laughter carrying faintly from somewhere in the courtyard where she worked, late into the evenings on the border relief plans, and Ashgrove Hold stood steady around them all, no longer simply a fortress built to survive threats from outside its walls, but something that had, slowly and honestly, over the course of one difficult, transformative year, finally become something both of them were proud to call home.